It's my favourite day of the year, seed sowing day. Today I'm going to be sharing with you every single thing you could possibly ever want to know about starting succulents and caudiciform plants from seed. Now, it's not necessarily going to be easy. If it was, everyone would be doing it. But the upsides are absolutely tremendous. First of all, you can get yourself really quite an impressive collection for a fraction of the price it would cost you going out and buying mature plants. You know that your plants are ethically sourced because you raise them yourself. And lastly, you're probably going to have so many spares left over that you can sell them, trade them away, or even give them to other enthusiasts. So, let's not delay. Let's start sowing some seeds, hey? Here we go. Now, before I jump into the process itself, I want to address something quite important. What families of plants is this process actually going to work for? It is, after all, a pretty jack-of-all-trades approach. And sometimes, as we know, different plants can have quite specific germination needs to get their seeds going. Well, why don't I follow that old adage, show don't tell, and I'll show you some of the graduates that I've had success with in the past. I know, for example, Euphorbias, they love this approach. Euphorbia buplerifolia, just one fantastic example. This one's a few years old. Any member of the Pachycaul family as well absolutely thrives, whether they be the Stapeliads, like this Quaqua mammillaris, or on the other side of the family, such as our Pachypodiums and our Adeniums, like this Pachypodium bispinosum. I know that aloes work well. Here's an aloe castelloniae that's graduated from this method. Any member of the Cucurbitaceae family, like this Dendrocyclos socotrana, seems to do well. I've got Dorstenias, Dorstenia levrani. I've got Dracaenas. I don't know the first thing about growing Dracaenas, but Dracaena cinnabari is doing pretty good. As well as really almost any of the pachycaul trees that I've tried to grow. You can see, for example, these pseudobombax ellipticums seem to be pretty happy right now, as well as members of the Operculicaryas family, Boswellias, so on and so forth. Now, the only different plants that I haven't had much success with using this method for, first of all, cacti, just need a little bit more humidity, and I'll make a separate video for them another day. As well as members of the Adenia family, they do germinate using this approach. I'm just not sure yet whether this is the most efficient way of doing it. And last of all, Cyphostemmas, members of that grape family. Doesn't really work too well for them, and I'd be avoiding this approach entirely. Plants that have got very, very fine seeds. I'll do an addendum at the end of this video about how we can address those, because there's just a tiny variation that we might want to approach if we're using that. Typically, we're talking about members of the Crasulaceae family, like Echeverias and those sorts of things. You can use this approach, but tweak it up a little bit. Now, let's jump in and see how this works. Now, what are we actually going to need to get these seeds going? Well, the joyful thing about this approach is not only does it work, but it's also pretty bare-boned. Don't need a whole lot to get these seeds going. Unsurprisingly, you are going to need a pot. I use 7cm pots, but any size will do, whatever works for you. You're going to need a nice mineral-rich seed starting mix. This is one that I've rigged up myself. I'll talk about the composition of it in a minute, but the composition doesn't matter too much. However, most crucially, you are going to need a mineral inorganic top dressing. This stuff here is called myfan stone. I love it, but you don't need myfan stone, just anything gritty that you can use as a top dressing. Now, if you want to add layers of complexity to this process, you want to extend your growing season, for example, you can also bring in optional extras, things like a heat mat, let you grow any time of year, not just when the sun warms up. You can also, of course, pair that with artificial lighting, and I'll talk about what my indoor setup looks like a little bit later in this video. And I'm not just here to get the seeds germinating and then abandon you. No, most of the difficulty is actually keeping these tiny little things alive. And so to help them along, something that I would suggest, but it's not necessarily a requirement, is a good soluble fertilizer. And I'll show you what I use in that space as well a little bit later on. When you bring all those things together, well, you're ready to start sowing some seeds. So let's do it. Now the first thing we're going to need to do is mix up a beautiful, gritty, heavily inorganic soil mix. Why? Because the plants we're trying to grow in the desert. They don't want to be waterlogged. They don't need heavy organic soils. So I like to mix up something that's about 80% mineral based. This has got a mix of all sorts of different things. There's a bit of pumice, a bit of scoria, a bit of vermiculite, a bit of granite in there, probably something else I've forgotten. And then put that in with about 20% seed raising mix to create what I think is quite a beautiful blend. However, you don't need to go overboard. If you can get your hands on some pumice, that stuff is absolutely brilliant for any sort of succulent plant. 80% pumice, 20% seed raising mix, and off you go. I will issue a warning. You want to make sure that all your minerals are well washed. You don't want dust in there. Dust is going to clog up the pores in your soil, and really it's going to become just as bad as your organic mix. It's not going to breathe, it's not going to let water through, it's going to be very heavy. Same thing about sand. If you want to use sand, that's okay, but it needs to be very, very coarse, not dusty, all right? So just be very, very careful about the nature of the inorganics that you mix into your soil, because soil almost invariably is the thing that causes these seedlings to die. Now, like I said before, you also are going to need to have a nice mineral top dressing. And like I said, I use Myfan stone. This is a pretty niche product, but you don't need to use it if you don't want to. Pumice, granite, whatever, coarse, anything. Something that's gritty, mineral, and can be layered on top of your soil is all you need. I like Myfan stone because it changes colour when it's wet. Lets me know, hey, it's time to start watering again. But again, I like to overcomplicate things. So we've got our soil. I'm going to load up a whole heap of pots now, get them ready for the next step of this process. So as you can see, I've got a whole heap of pots. They're in a tray bottom soaking at the moment with water, but I'm going to give them a bit of a hurry up. The old watering can. Just get them going from the top as well. Speed the process up, because who's got time to wait for pots to soak up so much water? Now, this water, it's not treated with anything. I don't use any sort of fungicides in this process. The nice thing about using a mineral top dressing is that what you'll find is that there's plenty of airflow, and they don't really need it. I don't find there are any sort of fungal issues if I follow this process exactly. So, pots are now soaked with water. Next step, we're going to sow some seeds. Our pots are loaded with soil. They're soaked right through. There's nothing to it now. Let's sow some seeds. Now, it's a perilously windy day today, not the sort of day that I'd ordinarily be sowing seeds out in the open. The sacrifices I make for you guys. Now, I've got some Aloe Castelloniae seeds. Handy piece of paper, just helps me spread them out. So, I'm going to put about, let's say 10 seeds in a pot. Depends on the size. Smaller seeds, you can probably get away with more. If I've got bigger seeds, I might end up putting about 5 per pot. In some instances, maybe even 1. Now, with my bit of paper, trying to not let the seeds get blown away in the breeze, I'm going to just spread these as evenly as I can over the surface of the pot. Beautiful, there we go. Didn't lose any. Now, the next step, as I've said multiple times, is crucial. I'm going to need to cover those seeds now with my top dressing. What that's going to do is create a beautiful, humid environment around those seeds, very conducive to germination, but it's also going to create something of an airy, oxygenated barrier that will keep fungal infections at bay. The perfect thing for little seeds. We won't see any damping off. So, in my case, go to my Myfan stone. Just going to put quite a thin layer. Only needs to be enough to cover the seeds. pat it down. There we go. I'll stick a label in that and that'll be good to go. Now there's also always the question of how deep do I sow my seeds? Well, it comes down to the size of the seed itself. The bigger the seed, the deeper it needs to go. If we're talking about very small dust-like seeds from plants like Echeveria, they need to be surface sown. You don't want to cover them up with the topsoil at all. That's why I'll address that separately at the end of this video. Those Alocastilloniae, merely surface sown on top and then covered with topsoil. Now, this seed, about the size of a pea, comes from a plant called Neorautenia mitis. I don't know if I said that right. Neorauteniana mitis, perhaps. Anyway, it is related to a pea, creates this huge tuberous root. So I've got a deeper pot, and because it's a bigger seed, I'm going to press it down about 1 centimetre into that pot before I cover it now with my topsoil. Never sown this plant before, it's pretty obscure, so we'll find out if that works. But as a general rule of thumb, the bigger the seed, the deeper it goes. So you've sown your seeds, and now they're just going to need a little bit of a push to get them to start popping up and ending up like a beautiful bunch of babies like these ones. They're going to need 3 things, what I might call the germination triangle. They're going to need heat, moisture and light. Light, not so important until they germinate, but they will need it pretty quickly thereafter. If it's summer where you are, or you live in somewhere that's quite naturally warm, those might be very easy things to provide. You can sow them out in the greenhouse or on a balcony, on a windowsill, keep them moist, water them every few days, and off you go. But if it's not that warm a location, or you're sowing in the off season, in autumn, in winter, whenever, well, sometimes we just need to give them that little extra nudge using the joys of man-made technology. So let's go check out my propagator, what I call my hot box, which I can use year-round to start seeds. Give them that heat, moisture and light with no trouble at all. You can see right now I'm in my laundry, and this is where the magic happens. This is where all my artificial heating and artificial lighting dreams come true. So I can sow seeds year-round. Doesn't matter what the temperature's like out there. We can get it all going in here. Let's have a look. So there's 2 stations in here. The top station, this is a really quite affordable setup. Fluorescent lighting above, worth about $50 from Bunnings in Australia, or the equivalent wherever you're from. Heat mats underneath, they're worth about $100, and you don't need a dedicated space like this to set something up. Something like this could go into a wardrobe or a cupboard without any troubles whatsoever. Down below, a little bit more complex. This is a repurposed reptile home, essentially an enclosed glass box. It's got air holes at the top to allow a bit of air movement. It never gets disgustingly humid in there, but it does retain a lot of heat, and it's been designed to enable me to really grow some of the more tropical caudiciform and succulent plants. Essentially anything from places like Madagascar or tropical East Africa. Now, the thing about heat and lighting is that it enables us to take a lot of control. The variance that comes with growing things out in the climate, especially when we're talking about quite sensitive plants, now it's all on us. Now we have complete control. So you're going to need, if you're doing this, a thermometer. You can see I've got a little doodad here that's recording the temperature on these pots. At the moment it's about 23 degrees, perfect growing weather. And when it comes to knowing how much light you need, this is where a lot of people get unstuck. And so what you're going to want to do online, on your phone, on whatever device you've got, you can find apps. They're called light meters. Typically they're used by photographers to, gauge the light in a scene. What we want to do though is repurpose one of those apps and use it to ensure that our plants are getting the right amount of light. What you'll do is you'll go outside and you'll find a bright shady spot, sort of spot where you would put these pots if you're growing them out there. Take a reading, and then when you set up your lights, depending on the height of the light, you'll see there's a variance in just the strength of the light hitting the top of the pots. You take a reading of the top of the pot, make adjustments in terms of height, and ensure that the tops of the pots are getting as much light here as they would in a bright shady position outside. It doesn't need to be full strength sunlight. You'll burn your plants. Also very hard to replicate inside. Of course, a setup like this will not enable you to grow mature plants. The light isn't strong enough. A lot of these plants, as they get bigger, will require significantly more sun. But for starting seedlings, it's a fantastic way to do it. And let me show you some examples. A lot of people will grow very leggy Euphorbia obesa seedlings. Typically, even grown outdoors in sunlight, they'll do it with what we call the baggy method. And the baggy method, here's an example. You sow seeds into a little bag and that creates that humid environment. But the bag actually locks out a lot of the light. But under these artificial lights, these plants getting exactly as much as they need. You can see they're nice, round, bulbous, no long stalks that are going to need to be buried later on. So, if you want to play God, you want to sow seeds year round, get yourself a setup like this. It's worth noting, you can see these lights are stronger. They're higher above the seedlings than these lights are, purely because of the strength of the light and the fact that down here I've got 2 strips of light compared to 1 above. Anyway, I'm going to get these, put them into the hot box and let the magic start to happen. We'll talk about how to care for these things next. Now, whether you've sown your seeds outside or inside, they've now got heat, bit of moisture, they're going to have light pretty soon. What do we do now? Well, it turns into a waiting game. How long do we have to wait? Well, really, it depends on the species that you've sown. Little members of the Opocinaceae family, like your Pachypodiums, your Adeniums, Stapeliads, they might only take a couple of days. I've had some pop up the next day. If you're looking at things like Euphorbias or Dorstenias, a week, 2 weeks later in some instances. And other things, well, really, the sky's the limit. In some instances, you could be waiting months to see any sort of movement. So patience is going to be key. The other question, of course, is, well, when should I sow my seeds? And that's all going to come down to seed viability. What that means is, how long are the seeds good for? How long are they able to survive in storage before they lose the ability to actually germinate? Again, that's going to depend on the different family of plants that you're sowing. Typically, I find members of the Opocinaceae families, like your Stapeliads, your Pachypodiums, as well as things like your Euphorbias, well, their viability can be relatively short. And that's why I will sow those plants straight away into my hot box year round whenever I got my seeds. For example, this is a pot of Matalea cyclophyllus, sown, let's say maybe a month or so ago, purely because I got them and I needed to get them down straight away. Similar story for these Euphorbia buruanas, which I received in the middle of winter, and I wasn't going to wait until springtime to get them to grow. However, for the most part, you'll find seeds will last at least a few months and able to get them into decent sowing conditions. And if you don't have a hot box, heat mats, all the rest of it, you should be okay waiting until springtime when temperatures start to warm up. But just be aware, the longer you leave it, the less likely you are to get great germination rates, because there's always a slow degradation in the quality of seeds over time. Now, let's start talking about what do we do when our seedlings start to pop up. Aftercare, here we go. We want to get some real big fatties. Look at this, like this Euphorbia pachypodioides, 1 year old, not a runt. How do we get them looking like that? Well, it's all about how we treat them after they germinate. You've followed my instructions, you've been patient, and now you've got seedlings popping up all over the place. How exciting! But how do we turn those itty bitty green specks into a big fat specimen like this in just 12 months? Well, we need to recognize that the first 12 months of any plant's life is typically its best opportunity to put on massive gains early. They go through what we could imagine as an exponential growth effect, where they go from something quite tiny to something an order of magnitude larger, a growth rate that they will never replicate again. What we want to therefore aim to do is to maximize the gains that we get out of that first 12 months. And we can do that by doing two things. The first of those is not letting them go dormant. And that's where having a setup like I showed you before is really a very beneficial thing, because almost all of these plants will start to go dormant as the temperatures fall. And while dormancy is a completely natural and normal part of their life, you're also potentially losing up to 6 months of potential growth where they could be putting on mass. Keeping them warm, keeping them watered, keeping them well lit, essentially is going to give them an extra 6 months to put on significant size. The other thing that we can do to maximize the returns on our growth is to use a dilute fertilizer. Now, something like this essentially will be used at a half strength rate. I use about half a teaspoon per every 9 litres, and I'll do that with every second watering of my plants. I bottom water them. That enables the pots to soak up as much of that fertilizer enriched water as absolutely possible. And then on the second watering, they'll just get ordinary water. What that does is it lets some of the salts building up from that fertilizer to leach away out of the soil, and you don't get strange build-ups of weird, pH levels going all over the place or anything odd like that. Essentially keeps the plants relatively happy, and it gives them a real boost in growth. What you will need to ensure is if the plants have spent 12 months in a hot box like that, they are going to need to spend a bit of time hardening off, gradually being introduced into the sun, air movement, all the rest of it. You can't just bring them straight out from under the house, plonk them in the sun and hope that everything's going to go fine. That'll be a recipe for disaster. Slow, gradual process introducing them out into the world. But when you've done it, and you've hardened off those plants, then you're ready to go. How exciting. Now, if you're trying to sow microscopic seeds, those little dusty seeds that come from plants like Echeveria, there's really only 2 changes I would make to this process. The first, I would ditch the top dressing. Just going to get in the way, smother the seeds. To create that humid atmosphere, the second change, put your pots into a plastic baggie like this. That'll create that beautiful moisture-rich atmosphere around the seeds that they need to germinate, make them very happy and enable them to start growing. I can show you here, these aren't Echeverias, these are Dudleya seeds, or seedlings I should say, but you can see just how well they're doing. Now, I would leave these in the baggie at least until they've got 4 or 5 adult leaves on them, and then they're ready to start going through that process of hardening off as well. Slow, gradual introduction to the outside world, starting just by cracking the plastic bag a little bit, letting a bit of fresh air in every now and then. After that, you might open the bag a little bit more, and in time, remove the pots from the bag altogether. You'll want to keep them regularly watered, but over time, they can start to dry out a bit. So, that's dust like seeds for you. Now, hopefully, today you've learned something. I've imparted every bit of knowledge I have about this topic upon you. But if you do have any questions, if I've left anything unsaid, hit me up in the comments by all means. I've put a link on the screen. That's where you can find anything related to this channel. You can find my Instagram. You can buy a t-shirt. Whatever you want to do, please feel free to support me however you choose, and subscribe if you want to. That's it for today. Happy growing and happy seed sowing.